Okay, good evening, members, ladies and gentlemen from Hong Kong. And first of all, let me introduce myself. It is Edmund Fong from IOSH Hong Kong branch, and I'm the MC for tonight's webinar. Thank you for all your participation to this webinar. So before start of the webinar, there are some rules and guidelines for the webinar's participants to follow. First of all, I will mute all participants during the webinar. If you want to say something or express yourself during the webinar, please type to the chat board, and please turn your screen to speaker mode, which is the best for watching. And please also be noticed that today's webinar will be recorded. So if you don't want to show up yourself in the screen, so just please turn the camera off. And the Zoom meeting will be locked after 15 to 20 minutes. And okay, after the rules and requirements being clearly told, let's start the webinar. Before I hand over the time to two speakers, there is an introduction of webinars today, which is talking about how to ensure the gap between work as emergent and work as done is reliably managed to improve safety. It is really a good question that we always think of this, and sometimes it is quite true that it is difficult to manage safety in reality. That's something we think cannot be realistically act on workplace. It is an advanced safety professional training program organized by Safety Culture and Safety Futures, which is a leading global learning and development consultancy. And some of my company's colleagues have joined and found that it is informative and useful, in particular, how to deal with the gaps of work as emergent and work as done. As a result, we're happy to invite Safety Futures to have a talk, sharing ideas with us on how safety practitioners can better understand how to ensure the gap between work as emergent and work as done is reliably managed to improve safety. Thanks, Dr. David Povin, the Managing Director, and Mr. Ralph Steve, the Executive Director of Safety Futures, to spend time for us to talk about this topic. And without further ado, I hand over the time to Dr. David, please.
Thank you, Shilung. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Hopefully the sound is coming through just fine, and video as well. And my colleague Ralph, can I just confirm, Ralph, is your audio okay?
Yeah, it's working now.
Perfect. So Ralph, would you like me to start by introducing you and introducing us?
Yeah, why don't we do the usual? You introduce me and I'll introduce you.
Great. So again, thank you for joining us. This topic that we're going to talk about today, ensuring the gap between work as imagined and work as done is reliably managed. We'll make sure that we all understand all of those terms as we go in. But Ralph, I was fortunate, well, my last large role as a safety director inside an oil and gas company, I started in 2010, 12 years ago. And the organization was growing very fast and we had lots of safety problems. And so the organization thought it would be very good for me to have an executive coach to help develop my capability to lead safety in the organization. And Ralph was the person that the company offered to be my coach as he was coaching the rest of the executive team as well. And so I had this opportunity to spend many years being coached by Ralph, and we're able to, I think, transform that organization, that operation into world-class safety performance. And so last year, fortunately, well, Ralph was living in Hong Kong, and with the lockdowns, we had the opportunity to partner together again in Safety Futures to implement these safety training programs. So Ralph has been a chief executive officer, a chief operating officer. He has a master's degree in coaching, a master's degree in major program management from very prestigious universities, and has taught me a lot about operations and leadership. And hopefully, Ralph, I've maybe taught you a little bit about safety along the way as well.
Yeah. I'm just going to come out of the program and come back in. I've got a disruption on the internet. Give me 1 minute, David. Sorry.
Okay, no problems. So let me continue while Ralph exits and rejoins. I guess we all have been getting very used to Zoom and Teams and WebEx and other platforms over the last year or so. So maybe if I introduce this topic, and then when Ralph rejoins, we'll be able to get started. So work as imagined, and please, for everyone, throughout this process, we don't have any slides or PowerPoints. We want to make this somewhat interactive. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We'll be watching the chat and we'll be able to answer those questions as we go. So work as imagined, what do we mean by work as imagined? This is a really important concept in safety and probably has been spoken about the most by Professor Eric Holnagel. And this idea that there is lots of views of the way that work gets done in organizations, and work as imagined is used to describe the viewpoint of our safety management system and what the management and the safety professionals, how we think that work happens. So the people who aren't in the organization performing the work, but it's the formal processes and procedures and our, I guess, belief about the way that work happens. So that's work as imagined. It's how we imagine work to be done, having not actually done the work or are not involved in the work. Work as done, on the other hand, is the way that the work actually happens, the way that the work is performed by the people who do it every day. And so this idea of work as imagined, work as done means that there will always be a gap. There will always be differences between the way that our procedures and standards and instructions and systems and management sort of say that the work will happen and the way that people actually do it. And so we need to know that there is always going to be this gap. And so in the topic of this talk that we'll do today will be how to make sure that we understand that gap, and how to make sure that we know what to do when we find that gap between work as imagined and work as done, and what to do about it. Because if we can close that gap or we can understand that gap, then we can make sure that the way that work is done is not exposing our people to hazards and risks. What we find in some operations is that gap is not explored by organizations, and you end up with people who are not involved in the work thinking that work is going very, very well, and the people that are doing the work in a very different way and end up becoming exposed to the hazards and risks. And it's only through the investigation after the incident where the organization realizes that work wasn't happening the way that they thought it was. Can I confirm whether, Ralph, are you back in the meeting now?
I am now back in the meeting.
Okay,
Can you hear
perfect.
me?
So yes, I can. What I just did was I explained work as imagined and I explained work as done. And then I briefly just talked about there always being a gap. And the most important thing is for us to understand that gap. And that's what we'll be explaining as we talk today. And I finished introducing yourself.
Right, but you haven't introduced yourself. So I think this is a very important thing. So David and I have been working together now for over 12 years. And a very important thing to understand about David is that he spent his career in safety in very hazardous operations. And in fact, where we started working together, it was an extremely hazardous $25 billion mega project. And David was specifically promoted, and I was brought in to work alongside him to deal with issues that included, alarmingly, fatalities. But this got David on a path where he learned more and more about operations, and indeed inspired me to learn more and more about safety. But David went on to become a very successful academic, won a very prestigious research award in Australia as part of getting his PhD, and is now seen as one of the leading thinkers about the safety profession, and has still maintained a very practical focus on operational aspects. And so what we're talking about here is a really, really important intersection between safety and operations, because the plan on how work should be done is at the end of the day a concept. And when there is a gap between that plan and the concept, a couple of very, very important things happen. So have you asked this question yet, David? I mean, what are the real vulnerabilities? And if any of you can answer this, what are the real practical vulnerabilities that occur in your organizations when there is a gap between the way you are thinking about work, how you're documenting it, how you're planning it, how you're standardizing procedures, how you're issuing permits, and the way work is actually being done? What are the practical implications and problems around that gap?
So hopefully, Ralph, people will be able to just put their ideas into the chat.
Yep.
And or you may even be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to. But if you just put those ideas in the chat, then so what are the practical problems and vulnerabilities if there's a gap between the way that we think work is happening and the way that it's actually happening? See if we can get one or two. We're going to ask lots of questions because this is the way that we will learn together. Okay, so Paul's just dropped in there a thing from before, Ralph. So the documentation will always be under prescribed. So I guess that idea there that the worker's imagined view will never be comprehensive enough. It will never say every single step in the process.
Okay, and then Chung Man thinks it's about through observation. So one of the issues there is that, yes, the observation will give us a better understanding of the nature of work. And it may actually give us a better understanding of what the exposure to specific hazards are that arise. And then marshal issues, especially when the project is on a multi-site, difficult to monitor. So yes, and there's something very important that you have to realize, and that is that we have to get involved with planning as early as possible. But in many ways, it's pre-planning. And it's pre-planning because the further we are in distance, whether that's spatially or time. So if we're a few kilometers away in an office from where the work front is, if we're a few hours away from before the work starts, whoever's putting together the plan doesn't have a really deep insight into the situation that the working team are going to face and the situation that the working team are in. And yes, I mean, a very good point that's come up here. Workers thought they're doing their job in a very safe way, but they were not even very clear about the hazards they face, not to say the control measures. Good point. And let's look at the other side. What about if the managers actually think that they understand what the situational hazards are, but actually don't? What if the prescription is part of the problem? So David, can we just talk a little bit, and let me throw this out to you, around this idea that once we start to imagine work and resource work, we're starting to blind ourselves to some of the variances that are real, and it affects our capacity to be resilient. Can we touch on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ralph. So the more that we plan, the more that we prepare, the more that we standardize and detail how work happens, the greater our confidence that we are in control of the work activity. And I guess what it can do, Ralph, is that it's very hard for us to second guess decisions and plans that we have made. So we are more likely with those detailed plans and processes around work to, I guess, not see beyond what our plans and procedures say. So we might lose the opportunity to see early warning signs that the plan or the process isn't quite right until something significant like an incident might occur. So it is a challenge because on one hand, we want to plan and prepare and prescribe and support work in as much detail as we can. And it also then may limit our ability to respond to the situation that we're facing.
Yeah, and again, we'll use the chat line, and let's ask a very, very important question. What are the benefits of standardizing work? So in terms of safety outcomes, what are the benefits that an organization gains when it starts to standardize work? It starts to get to this point and going, well, here are the procedures. This is how we want the work to be done. So perhaps you can just share your thoughts on what some of the benefits are. Okay, so we've got save manpower, consistent approach, perhaps consistency on message, easy management, outcomes, no surprises, standardizes. Okay, we'll come back as well to Michael Young's point on working in the construction sector. I've spent most of my life in the construction sector. I would actually argue that because the construction sector is so exposed to variable situational hazards, it has a higher need for resilience than healthcare even. But sticking to this point, we've got some clear benefits on standardization. David, what do you think some of the fundamental benefits of standardization are?
Well, I think Ralph, rarely in organizations do we do work in isolation. So I think it's really important to know how work is being performed so that you can coordinate your activities with other teams in the organization, so that you can hand over activities to other shifts. You can partner with contractors and other providers. So if organizations don't have an idea about how or a process for how certain activities get done, it's very hard for the organization to support that. It is very hard for teams to work together and interact. So in a lot of ways, it is very important for companies to standardization helps people align on the way that things the way that, I don't want to use the word should, the way that things are intended to happen.
Yeah. So one of the very, very big benefits of standardization is it reduces cycle time. We get more competent. We do the same thing over and over again. We become more efficient. And I think some of the points here are, increasing productivity without injury, ideally. Easier to detect variance, very much so. Standardization starts to drive cost efficiency, starts to drive productivity. And what are some of the disadvantages of standardization? So over to you, team.
We've got some comments there, Ralph, about it doesn't account for adaptate or necessary adaptation and in dynamic environments.
Yeah.
Create some liability if work doesn't happen like that. Yeah.
Yeah, training focused on the standard rather than the occasional differences. Here's one of the biggest problems with standardization. Standardization as an approach to work becomes very, very problematic when the context and the situation that the work's being performed in is dynamic and variable. We start to put square pegs into round holes. And so when we start to think about work that has to be very context specific, dangerous work, context there, well, what are some of the contexts that drive safe systems of work? What are the things that we need to be thinking about? Work as imagined versus work as done effectively. So at the work as imagined phase, let's now go to what do we actually have to design into a safe system of work for it to be safe?
I think just while we're answering that, Ralph, I wouldn't mind sharing a story if you don't mind.
Sure.
What do we need to design in? Because I think this is this need in dynamic environments, and particularly when things change, the more standardized and prescribed our work is, the less capacity we have to respond, like has been said here. And there's a couple of very specific examples that I think have been highlighted in the safety science literature. One is the Piper Alpha disaster, where 168 or 169 fatalities, and all of the people who died were following the emergency response procedure and moving to the accommodation module to be helicopter evacuated from the platform. And all of the people who survived were the people who broke the procedure, realized that was a dangerous situation, and jumped into the North Sea and waited to be rescued by boats. Well, and then also, if we think about the American Airways flight that Captain Sullenberger landed on the Hudson River, he didn't follow any of the procedures, didn't follow the instructions of air traffic control, but took the course of action in that situation that was against the procedures and the instruction. And I guess these are two very extreme examples, but it goes that that the plan is the plan for normal operations. It won't predict every situation that your people face. So Ralph, how have we gone here in the chat now?
So Chain has talked about situational awareness, which is a very good point. And Manish Kumar has talked about elements once missed in standardization is ignored ever after until reviewed. And Paul's talking about similar situation with the Grenfell.
Another great example. The emergency response there was telling people to stay put, and if they had have initiated an immediate evacuation, they probably would have saved everyone.
Yeah. So here's something to think about. So you haven't specifically answered the question, but that's okay. A safe system of work, whichever legislative regime, and I'm very familiar with the Hong Kong legislative regime, I'm very familiar with the UK legislative regime, the Australian one, it almost doesn't matter. The similarities are astounding. It all starts with the fact that we need a safe system of work when there is a hazard that we can't eliminate. And we therefore are compelled by law to reduce the risk of harm to people as low as is practicable. And of course, we all know what practicable means, which Edwards, everything refers back in some way to the 1949 Edwards versus National Coal Board. It's really, really clear what practicable means. What's not clear is what the hazards are going to be. And what organizations tend to be very good at is documenting task hazards, because tasks are quite stable, but not so good at predicting situational hazards. So let's actually start by looking at why are organizations so good at documenting task hazards. So David, can we talk a little bit about the type of things that we put into well thought through and well executed safety management systems?
Yeah, in terms of the elements, Ralph, or in terms of, yeah. So I guess our safety management systems are really there to support normal, routine, known types of operations. We talk a lot about the work that we do because companies think in terms of the work that they do, not always that the situations they do that work in. So if my job in my organization, my maintenance task might be to replace a pump. And so a lot of effort in the safety management system is going to be how to actually execute that task safely. So I'll have compliance requirements, training requirements for replacing a pump. I'll have emergency response arrangements around that pump. I'll have risk registers around that task of changing the pump. Lots of the organization is geared towards, Ralph, the work that it does in the elements of the system and all of our procedures. We will have a procedure for replacing a pump. Now, what that doesn't do is account in any way easily for what situations does the pump replacement happen within? What's that broader context around the work? So organizations are very good at thinking about the tasks that are known and performed, but not great at dealing with the dynamic environments that those tasks are done within.
Yeah. And let's go to a very real example, and we're going into a very, very simple industry. Solar panels. Very, very easy to document. how to install solar panels, how to build the brackets, how to fit them to the roof, how to fit the panels to the brackets. That's actually very, very stable. That's actually quite predictable. And we can get very good at how to execute those procedures. Much harder to document what roof it's going to be installed on. You're going to could be installing it on a roof with a steep slope, could be a flat roof, could be a roof with a skylight, could be a roof with edge protection, could be a roof made of pressed metal, could be a tiled roof, could be a concreted flat roof, could be all sorts of things. It's also very hard to document the condition of the workforce, their level of experience. Their attitude towards their work can't be predicted. Their level of fatigue can't be predicted. So now we start to get to a really interesting situation that if we are standardizing the safe system of work, then how do we really know that it's going to fit the situation that we're going to be working in? And this is part of the problem, that when we start to create a big gap because we've standardized work, we've got to be very careful that we don't take an assumption that, well, the workers are at fault because they've moved away from how we've documented it. Workers imagined is right. Well, who imagined it? What makes that person the expert on the situational hazards, the situational factors, and the context in which that work has got to be done? What are your thoughts on that, David? What level of expertise can you possibly have from an office compared to the team that's actually on the site?
Yeah, I mean, you could spend a lot of time trying to think about all of the different situational issues that a team could face, about weather and that, but you would almost be writing, Ralph, an endless list of possible scenarios. And this is also what organizations sometimes do, is actually prepare these endless kind of lists and checklists and requirements. But like you said earlier, when you are in time or space, so if you are removed physically or in time from that situation, it almost is a impossible effort to try to predict all of the different situational hazards that may be present. I mean, how do you know the vehicles there or dangerous animals? Like, you just have no capacity to predict reliably the situations that people will be in. Yeah.
And so now we get caught up in a very, very simple and very, very fundamental problem. And it's been around for ages. A Prussian general, von Moltke, in the 1800s said, "No plan survives initial contact with the enemy's main force." He's often misquoted. People often say, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." Not what he said. What he was actually saying is initial contact with the enemy's main force. So let's get away from the military. It's where I started my life, but we'll get away from it. We'll look at the type of work that we're all doing now. Put that into context, what von Moltke was saying. When the job gets to the really dangerous stuff, we're probably going to have to adapt some elements of the plan. And this is now this very interesting idea, and I don't know how familiar you guys are with the current literature on black line and blue line and red line. So the workers imagined and workers done is often represented by a black line and a blue line, and there's usually a red line which shows the hazards. And we don't want the blue line, work as it's being done, to get too close to the hazards. But here's an important question. So David, based on the research and the literature and some of the research you've done, does the blue line always bring the worker closer to the hazard?
It doesn't, Ralph. No. So we know that experience counts for a lot, and so we're talking about real people doing real work with real experience of doing that task. And the people who are prescribing, like you said, the black line, the workers imagined, generally have less experience with the task than the people who they're writing the procedures for and the systems and standards for. And so there's many things that happen in a work activity to keep people safe that can also be quite hard to write down in a procedure. So often, and in my experience, when I've spent time observing work groups, I've seen them doing things that are not included in the procedure that are unnecessary for them to be doing or are different to what's in the procedure. And then when asking that group, why did you do that? That's not in the procedure. They're explaining a reason they're doing it for safety. So what we find sometimes, Ralph, is that people's work as done can actually be safer than what we've written in a procedure, because they've learned how to keep themselves safe. They might have had an incident or an event or been taught something at some point in their career, and our procedures don't even cover that.
And this is now a very, very important point for safety practitioners, safety professionals. We've got to be very careful that we don't approach the gap between work as imagined and work as done on the basis that gap exists because workers aren't complying with regulations and standards. Actually, in a lot of cases, in very dynamic industries where resilience is an essential element of the strategic response to the dynamic nature of the operation, we get variation because it's needed. It's actually necessary to adapt, to deal with the context and the challenges that exist. And so if we were to take a non-variant approach, if we were to take as a safety professional, if we were going on the assumption of we've got this variation, it's actually a deviation. And that deviation is putting the organization at risk. We're actually potentially going to aggravate the issue and make the organization less safe. So we've got to think very, very carefully around under what circumstances should we create an environment and a safety capacity within our organization and our workforce that they can vary appropriately. So it's not a free-for-all in variation, but it's an adaptive response. And so one of the things, David and I are both senior advisors to the International Atomic Energy Agency on leadership and on resilience, two separate subjects, but they merge. And there's a very, very interesting debate. And David, can you just share a little element on the debate around, if we optimize for efficiency and by standardization, how does that affect our ability to adapt to different contexts as they emerge?
Yeah, Ralph, absolutely. And then what I might do is just share a black line, blue line diagram. There's just been a request in the chat to clarify that language that we use. So I'll answer the question, and then we might, if you'd like me to, I can share that diagram and could just briefly make sure that
I was looking for the diagram myself. So
that's
you
okay.
answer the question and I'll look for the diagram.
I've got it. So we need to understand that organizations are always trying to be more efficient. So this idea of faster, better, cheaper. We can be faster, we can be better, we can be cheaper, and that's often what organizations are trying to achieve. What we need to understand is that narrows the range of options that we have for work activities. You can respond to any challenge if you have enough time and enough information and enough resources. You can manage any risk, respond to any challenge. When you start to limit the time, the information, the resources, because organizations are trying to be more and more efficient, Ralph, it does two things. It makes your organization less likely to identify and see the changes that need to be responded to, and less what Professor David Woods would say is, with less resources, you'll have less capacity to maneuver. You'll have the less ability to be able to respond to those changing circumstances and maintain safety. So this push for efficiency really narrows the performance envelope of work and the system.
Has that model just come up on the screen?
That is perfect. Yes, it has. Okay,
so let's just talk through some aspects of this now. So if you haven't seen a representation of the black line, the black line is work as imagined. I mean, you notice it's a straight line. It's a straight line because it's consistent. We don't want variance. This is, if you like, the non-variant response. We've standardized, We've put our intellectual capital to work. We've developed a way of doing it, and that's the way that we want it done. The reality of the situation is, and it's interesting, a recent comment I saw suggested that safety professionals should all at least have a minor in psychology, which I certainly think that social sciences should be taught to safety practitioners, and not just a narrow behavioral-based science, a broader view of applied psychology, the realities of how humans make decisions. Because when you put humans in a situation where you tell them they have to do work this way, and their knowledge and experience and their skills and their understanding of the context says, well, that won't work. That will make it more dangerous. That will actually introduce risk into the system. People adapt. It's what we do. We are adaptive creatures. And so now we get this idea of the blue line. And if you notice, the blue line isn't a flat line at all. It's a dynamic line. And we're responding to dynamic events. We may be responding to hazards, but we don't just respond to hazards. Operationally, we might be responding to resource constraints. Operationally, we might be responding to other contextual factors, deadlines, capital constraints, a whole bunch of stuff. So work, when it's being performed by humans, actually becomes quite adaptive and quite emergent. And that's also a very important thing to understand, because it actually means that in a dynamic system such as this, we have to think about safety as an emergent property of the system. So David, can I just throw the ball back to you? And I know you've published papers on this, but can we just talk about that a little, please?
Which part of that? Sorry, Rob.
Safety is an emergent property of the system, of the work system.
So this idea that that safety is an outcome. It's like the amount of production that we've achieved in a particular day. And so it's actually the sum or the outcome of all of the work processes and the activities that get done. So safety, it means that it makes it very difficult to manage safety by focusing on safety. Instead, Ralph, this idea that to give ourselves a better chance of getting the safety outcome that we want, we actually have to work on the work that people do, not the safety processes that they do before the work or during the work or after the work, but actually the core way that the work happens, the people, the work process, the safety of the equipment that they're using. The only way to give ourselves a better chance of creating a safety outcome is to focus on the work, not on safety, if that makes sense, because that isn't always intuitive for safety professionals.
Correct. And then notice that you've now got an alternative. So if we accept the reality that variation is not just inevitable, but may actually, and in many circumstances is proven to be beneficial to the organization, both in terms of financial outcomes, operational outcomes, and safety outcomes. It's not that we lose control, but we now actually go to a resilience threshold, an expectation, a standard. Will allow variation, but we now understand, and the role of the safety professional changes in this environment, because now the safety professional has to start to become an expert on what the organizational safety capacities actually are, not where they're imagined to be. What level of variation can we cope with? What can we resource? How are people trained? How effective are their decision making? We won't go into all of the things on this chart. That's a longer discussion. But now, if you have a deep understanding as a safety professional, you can help the organization to say, look, we're not going to be non-variant, but we'll allow variation within limits. And those limits are defined by a threshold. And that threshold is relatively easy to understand. And it's kind of like, if we stay above the threshold, our capacity to recover from emergent hazards and challenges is very high. If we cross it, it's low. So we don't want to cross the threshold. And then the last bit of explaining the diagram, if you notice the hazard lines not constant. Hazards increase, hazards decrease. Sometimes they decrease because we're taking active measures. We're eliminating them. We're minimizing them. Sometimes they decrease because many hazards, particularly in activities like construction, are emergent hazards. Some of them are very situational. Some of them are quite transient. And so we've now got a representation. If you've never seen this chart before, I hope it helps you understand it. But we're now seeing work as a very dynamic process. The hazards aren't fixed. Probably the organizational safety capacities aren't fixed either. What we do now fix is this idea that there is a resilience threshold, a line that we don't cross. And this is very consistent with what legislation expects from us. So if you wanted an explanation on the black line, blue line, has that helped? Just use the chat. Marshall Rosario, has that given you a better understanding?
And Ralph, while we get an answer from Marshall, there's a comment also from Marshall in the chat about auto crews. I think it might be worth saying that blue line, when we're watching people work, things can look very smooth. But do you want to talk about what Carl Weick said about safety as a dynamic non-event?
Yeah, and I think this is really, really important, and it's probably something that the safety profession can and should learn from operations. Just as there's many things that operations can and should learn from safety, there are some things that the safety professionals can learn from operations professionals. Carl Weick made a comment that safety was a dynamic non-event. What was he really saying? He was actually saying that an awful lot of things are happening to get nothing. So to have no incident, there's an awful lot of things that are happening, and they're dynamic things. And these are, some of these things we don't necessarily realize from afar. So even our observation programs tend to miss them. We're coming into the field. People can see we're coming into the field. We very rarely get to see normal work. The other thing about the many and varied things that people do to have this dynamic non-event, no incidents, is very nuanced, very nuanced. They're often very small things. They're very delicate. They can be quite elegant. They can be easily missed. Perhaps the most dangerous thing is that we end up not understanding that to not have an incident, there's lots of stuff we have to do, and we can paint ourselves into a dangerous position where we go, well, we didn't have an incident yesterday, didn't do anything in particular yesterday, so don't have to do anything today. And actually, I think that the really important thing to start to do is to move, as a profession particularly, safety professionals in particular, into getting a better understanding of normal work that achieves safe outcomes, so that we begin to understand the myriad of little things that we do that actually build our safety capacity. And I think this is a huge gap. So David, when you looked at your research into the role of the safety professional, how do you think conventional training and development programs have prepared safety professionals to understand safety capacities in organizations?
So I think it's really challenging, Ralph, because the safety profession needs to, and it was mentioned earlier in the chat, I think like Paul, I think maybe that there's always something else to learn. And safety, the expectations of a safety professional is there's almost an impossible long list of everything that you might want to know about. You mentioned psychology earlier, and engineering sciences, and all of the interpersonal capabilities that you need to have. So I think, Ralph, that we need to understand as safety professionals that our safety training programs are really the tip of the iceberg in what we need to know to understand our organizations and to be effective. And safety education has traditionally focused on the safety specific information. And I guess, Ralph, what we're saying here is that safety specific information has a place, and there's such a broad operating context of work in our organization that lots of our safety education doesn't really prepare safety professionals to be able to understand well.
Yeah. And I think that, I think let's get back to the point. How then do we as safety professionals, and indeed operations professionals, I think it's equally important to understand that we don't stand on our own and shouldn't stand on our own. We have to work in partnership. Safety, operations, even finance. This is something where we actually have to start to think about what is it that we need to do to successfully navigate and achieve our business objectives in the presence of the sort of uncertainties and the need for adaptive responses. We're operating in complex environments. We need adaptive capacities. We need dynamic safety capacities. So what's the role of the safety professional in helping organizations develop those adaptive capacities? Any thoughts? You got thoughts, shoot them up on the board, but what we'll now do is start to share with you some fundamentally proven techniques that come from organizations that can demonstrate that they do a lot better than would reasonably be expected by working in quite hazardous and dynamic environments. And if you're not familiar with high reliability organizations, hopefully you will be at the end of this conversation, because there are some lessons to be learned from high reliability organizations. And I think I remember learning this from David many years ago. Perhaps one of the most important lessons is the role that high reliability, the defining role that high reliability organization research played in safety science when it first emerged. So David, do you want to just share with everybody what was special about looking at work being done successfully as opposed to how most safety science research has been conducted before that?
Yeah, and there's a really important lesson here, Ralph, for I guess how we think as safety professionals about where we spend time in our organizations, because in the mid-'80s, when the high reliability organization research started, it was actually the first time that safety researchers had looked at safe operations. Every safety approach and model and theory before then was focused on disasters and accidents and trying to reverse engineer a safety theory. And it was really, I guess it was only the 1980s when safety researchers said, well, this doesn't make any sense. And Eric Holnagel sort of famously said, it's like trying to understand how to have a happy marriage by studying a few cases of divorce. Like, yes, you might learn a little bit about a happy marriage by studying what causes divorce, but you won't learn everything that you need to know about that. And without going too much further, Ralph, I think what's really important there with the high reliability theory is they went to air traffic control and naval aircraft carriers and nuclear power in the US and said, this is really complex, dynamic, and risky work. There should be accidents here, and there's not. So why are there not accidents? And they came up with very new things that had never been talked about in the safety literature, in the safety models based on accidents. And I think, Ralph, the lesson there for us in organizations about managing the gap between work as imagined, work as done, and as safety professionals is that, are you spending enough time in understanding the normal day-to-day blue line, if you like, of work as done, when there's no incidents, there's no issues, there's no problems? Are you understanding, what's going on to create that, and how you can promote and support that as an organization? So, Ralph, I think that's what high reliability organization theory can teach us about this topic of this talk. Yeah,
and to sort of pave the way so we can actually finish with some questions and wrap this up, where the literature on high reliability organizations got to is it really came out with some constructs and said, well, high reliability organizations tend to have this focus of learning, particularly from failure. They don't necessarily see failure as the end of something, it's the beginning of an opportunity to learn. And high reliability organizations tend to organize back from the front line. There's this sensitivity to operations. There's this deference to expertise. And so how does that change, or how does that type of thinking, or should that type of thinking change the role of the safety professional in this world where there is almost always a gap between workers imagined and workers done? And it is this idea that we've got to build safety capacities in our organization. And that's great in theory. So what are some of the practical things that we need to do? Well, having sensitivity to operations and deference to expertise ultimately means that as safety professionals, we want to see our organizations enable and empower frontline leadership and teams to make the right decisions in the right way in their operational context. So it actually suddenly means that we've got to move past this world where the center knows better than the front line. It can't. In complex operating environments, it can't. And when you actually start to look at Holnagel's work, and you actually start to then extend it and look at Woods's work on adaptive capacities, safety now actually has to get involved in the business of ensuring that people are dynamic risk managers. They're not doing risk management, they're managing risks. They're making decisions. It's suddenly this moment where we go, a safe system of work can be conceptualized, but it's actually got to be thought through and implemented by frontline people. And as safety professionals, our role is to support that, ensure that those people understand how to design and implement safe systems of work. And so suddenly we start to see something that we're seeing globally. We're seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in Latin America. If anybody on this call has got an HR background, don't listen to this bit, you'll be offended. But what we're seeing globally is that as HR has shifted into payroll and self-service bureaus and rules, we're starting to see a more dynamic safety profession that's much more interested in organizational learning, people learning, and building safety capacities by ensuring that teams can dynamically plan their work, that the team itself can turn around and make the right adjustments to ensure that the safe system of work is relevant, can be complied with, can achieve better outcomes. So these are very fundamentally important things that the safety profession has to start getting involved in. It's got to be involved in developing the safety capacity of the organization to be able to deal with complexity, to be able to deal with emergence. We can't take an ill-informed view and go, well, let's ban emergence. Let's not have emergence in our operating system. David, what are your thoughts on some of the other things that the safety profession needs to get involved in to help manage this gap?
Yeah, I think I just want to make a few points, Ralph, if that's okay. I think towards the end. And it's a quote that you always use, Ralph, and I'm not going to place it in the right way, but it's this quote that safety isn't an intellectual exercise. It's truly a matter of life and death. And so this idea of work as imagined, we can in safety sometimes get inside our own head about this perfect procedure and this perfect system, and let's sit in a room and let's do all of the thinking and let's craft this, but it's not an intellectual exercise. And I guess what that means is that safety can't be this set and forget thing where we've written a process, we've got a set of rules, we've got a training program, we've done safety, people just now need to follow what we've written. That will widen the gap between work as imagined, work as done. And so that means the activities we need to be involved in, Ralph, is yes, we need to have all of those things, but as safety professionals, we need to understand that at 8 or 9 o'clock today, when we turn up to work, and our people have probably been working since 6 or 7 o'clock already, today is not just yesterday a little bit later. Today is a brand new day with brand new hazards, brand new risks, brand new things that are appearing in the operation. And we need to understand how our tasks are focused on understanding what is happening today in our business. And the last point that I wanted to make is a point that Professor Eric Holnagel, he's quite ill at the moment, but he signs off every single email that he sends with a quote that says, "The gap between work as imagined and work as done is greater than we can imagine." And I guess his message there is that we should expect the way that work happens to surprise us a lot of the time. And we shouldn't, I guess, shy away from that as safety professionals, and we shouldn't put our head in the sand. We should actually really seek to understand that.
Good. Very good. So I think that's the punchline. I mean, I think that there is a gap. And wherever there's a gap, we've got to be very careful that the gap doesn't create a vacuum. And nature doesn't like vacuums, and organizations don't like vacuums. And I think a really wonderful opportunity for the safety profession to reconceptualize whether that gap is a threat to safety or whether it's actually an opportunity for the safety profession to turn around and say, well, somebody needs to help lead the charge on developing safety capabilities. The capacity, the organizational capacity to deal with complexity and to deal with emergence, we can't put our head in the sand on this. So we've got to make sure that our workforce, and we've seen these changes, our workforce are developing those personal capabilities that create the organizational capacity. And it's not unique. Military operations have changed. David and I are working with a group of international experts on the International Atomic Energy Agency's response to resilience. It's complex. The response is complex. The subject is complex. But it's this realization that you can't run a nuclear power station solely on a rule book. There's got to be adaptive capacity. So, that's not to throw away all the stuff that we've done to build procedures and have systems and comply with regulations, still important. It's not to throw away everything we've done on building effective safety cultures, engaging leadership in caring about safety, helping people to understand what the safe behaviors that are part and parcel of keeping them and their colleagues safe, still important. But it means that we've got to move into a brave new world where we start to build the resilient and adaptive capacities that will actually ensure that our organization and our colleagues live and thrive. So, and that's the final punchline. So over to you guys, if you have any questions. Unless I've got this wrong, we expect it to be finishing at 1:30, so that's given us 15 minutes if it's needed for questions. If you have any, either throw them up on the chat line. I have to say, very hard to deal dynamically with questions that aren't being talked through, but anybody got any questions?
Ralph, there's a question there while we're getting hopefully a few more, that are businesses too siloed for risk to be addressed appropriately? So we've got a safety team, a health team, a financial team, a HR team. And when you're in operations, I guess, are we too siloed in our thinking about risk?
I think that, and this is, so my professional background is mega projects. And one of the things that has really shaped major program management has been this idea that it's not the same as project management. It actually needs to be driving the decisions around how mega projects are managed. And if I take that thinking to risk, the silos are problematic while they behave as though they are the owner of the risk. Having capability in silos is very, very useful because you can build deep expertise. And if those silos are in service of the operation, so the front line becomes the owner of the risk and the people from the silos come and support that, then it's not actually problematic because the point of integration is operations. It's the front line. But it's usually problematic if the point of integration is a function in a head office somewhere, particularly if it's a global corporation and you happen to be operating in Japan and headquarters is in New York, then it's hugely problematic. So I don't know whether that's an answer that people like.
Yeah,
so I like
that
point, Simon. Sorry, Simon Ross has just said, thank you. I couldn't agree more. Shouldn't be an issue of ownership, but collaboration. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so everyone, we've heard from the organisers that the mute's been taken off. So if you prefer just to unmute yourself or put your hand up, and we can call on you. Hopefully, one of those two processes. You may just want to ask us the question verbally, or you can have it in the chat. So I invite you to ask a question if you would like to, or write it in the chat. A solution. So Marshall Ralph is talking about a solution about work as imagined, work as done. And I guess this is Ralph, if I have a first go and then I'm interested in your thoughts. So we've worried a lot in safety at the gap between what our rules say and what is the way that work happens. I mean, we have audits and we call that non-compliances, and we work really hard to try to make work fit our plans and processes. And I guess where work as imagined, work as done, and the model that we showed provides a broader solution is to say, our focus needs to be on the gap between the blue line, the way that work's happening, and the hazard and the risk. Just making things comply and follow a procedure is not the goal. The goal is to make workers not exposed to the hazards and risks. So I guess where it provides a little bit more of a solution, Marshall, is in my view, a broader perspective to go, we want to understand the way that we intended work to happen. We want to understand the way it is happening. And we want to understand what the implications of the way that it is happening in relation to safety and risk. So it's not compliance for compliance sake, it's understanding the work so that we understand whether it's encroaching on the safety margin around the work. So Marshall, I guess the solution is as simple and as difficult as that, which is we need to understand the work. Ralph, your thoughts?
So totally support what you've said. And then I'd add something which is a bit of a personal disappointment for me, that I think it was 2009, the International Standards Organization redefined risk as the effect of uncertainty on business objectives. And somehow nobody picked up on that. Somehow we just continued to see risk as this thing that we had to wrestle into submission and eliminate, which is actually kind of against the rules of the universe and how it functions. Because risk is, there's downside risk, but there's also upside risk. There's opportunity as well. And I think that one of the really important things about the gap is that we don't necessarily have to fear the gap if we know how to respond to it. So I think at a very, very practical level, and this will sound quite dumb, and my apologies for that, maybe when you think about it, it won't seem quite so dumb. But software solutions, integrated enterprise software like SAP, have driven most organizations into highly specialized, centralized planning functions. And what that's actually done is it's taken the planning function into this, as we've used contractors as well, the planning function centrally spits out a work order. It gets bid against, it gets quoted on, it gets awarded. These plans are locked in. So we are doing much more imagining work and documenting it and specifying it and even prescribing it, particularly when we use contractors. And we're doing much less of the, okay, this is pre-planning. Here is this honest view that we think this is how this should play out. And we're open to the fact that it may not play out that way. And therefore, we're going to ensure that our organizational structures support collaboration, our development processes support dynamic planning and collaborative planning. And we move away from this top-down hierarchy where the center directs work into a role where the center sees it has a contribution to make to add value to the front line by helping it build adaptive capacity. And if that sounds as a difficult challenge, that's because it is. And we can't shy away from that. We're going to have to fundamentally reconceive how organizations function as they become bigger and more complex. So no easy answer.
No. Great insight, Ralph. Thank you. I guess Paul's just dropped in right then. Good timing, Paul. Our negativity bias, which I think he's saying used to be a prerequisite for a role in safety, which is, to sort of see the negative in lots of situations, the non-compliances, the incidents, the problems, kind of maybe steers us towards the negative elements of risk and not the positive reward elements. And I think, Paul, I agree. I'm not sure there's a question there, but I think it was a realization for me in my career where I spent so much time thinking about safety and what was not being done for safety. So it was, we hadn't implemented this. We weren't compliant with that. We had this incident that we needed to do. There was, our performance was getting worse. It was lots of, like you say, deficit and negativity, Paul, around the safety. And once I flipped my perspective to say, it's not about safety, it's about the work that people do and how the organization supports that work to occur effectively every day, then it actually becomes much more positive and exciting, because I'm not focused on as much the safety things anymore as I am focused on, the work and what people are doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it like that, and what it is in the organization that's influencing it like that. But I agree with you, Paul. I think it has been in safety for a while. Then this next one we've got, Ralph. The people involved, plant and machine working method. So what you said there is a great. So not sure exactly to pronounce Leong. There's this idea in safety about people, plant, and process. So to manage safety, we need to have the capability of the people, the safety of the plant and machinery they use, and the work method that they follow. This sort of people, plant, process. And I love that you've added work environment in there, like the situational hazards, like we mentioned earlier. So should this be the case? So I think what you've said there is a great framework for understanding work. What are the capabilities of the people in relation to what they do? What is the safety of the equipment that they're using? What is the real work process that they're following? And what are the situations and environments that they're performing work in? And that's work as done. And understanding that is exactly, I guess, what we're talking about now. And then when you find a gap between work as imagined, work as done, you have two choices, three really. But usually organizations should have two choices. One is, what do I need to change? Do I need to adjust the work as imagined? So this work process is perfectly fine. There's no reason that it can't be our work process, or added as a second option for a work process. Perfectly safe, perfectly fine. We understand it's a good way of doing it. We add it to our work as imagined or our procedures as an option. Doesn't need to change. The other way that you thought it should be done could be good as well. Or we need to go, well, actually, no, this work is going closer to the hazard, and we actually need to change and adjust this work. Now, that doesn't necessarily involve telling people to now follow the procedure, but it's about really understanding why it was being done like that, and what the risk is and how to change it. So I did some work with Professor David Woods, and we sort of said that safety people need to be obsessed about how people are adapting their work and changing their work. And I think that's a really good piece of advice. So monitoring, said Leong, monitoring the people, the equipment, the process, the environment, and what should you do with what you learn?
Yeah. Good answer, David. Good insight.
So we'll give it one more.
Sorry, just one last bit to add to that. Somebody's got to actually understand safety capacity and organizational safety capacity. Having been a COO in the course of my career, it was my job to understand operational capacities. And I think what we've currently missed is that the reality of the gap between work as imagined and work as done is that our response to it is based around what safety capacities our organization has. So if we're going to allow people to adapt to challenges as they emerge, we have to know that they're capable of making the right decisions, that they know how to plan collaboratively, that they've got the skills that are necessary to make those types of decisions. You know, you can't devolve decision making to the front line if the front line isn't competent in making those types of decisions. And so I think that adding to what one small thing to what David said is that the idea of us as safety professionals monitoring this is that we become trusted advisors to operations on, actually, this might be outside our current safety capacity. This may be a bridge too far for us. Let's shut this one down. Very important. Sorry, back to you, David.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ralph. And I'll just comment on Manish's point there in the chat. And Manish, thanks for your comments. You've made some great comments on the way through the discussion. It talks about Deming's work and plan, do, check, act, and doing things right the first time and operating rhythm. And I think Deming has said a lot of really useful. He's, I guess, most famous for his work on quality management, largely in the 80s. And Deming said a couple of things I think are really important in safety that we haven't really taken on. He did say, similar to what we've said today, is if you're focused on the outputs of the process, it's too late. So this whole idea of defects and quality control at the end of the process, you need to focus on actually the inputs and the processes so that the outputs take care of themselves. And I think that's a point that we were making quite clearly today. And he also said something that I like, that as soon as a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure of anything. And I think in safety, it's like Paul's comment, we've weaponized a lot of things that we do in safety around compliance and incident rate targets and lots of things. So a lot of our information is manipulated and adjusted and changed because we've weaponized things that could be useful for us in understanding work as imagined and particularly work as done. But the way that we use that information in our organization means we never get to see, the true picture.
Yeah. And I think if I sort of aggregate Manish's points and Paul's points, if we saw risk as the effects of uncertainty on our business objectives, then we should also foresee the potential to build safety capacity, because we are failing early, maybe even failing often, but failing safely. And this is an element, and we can't talk about this point, but our organization is currently in negotiations with a really high-performing organization. It's highly confidential. They want us to work with their leadership team to improve their decision-making capacities. And they have a very, very distinct view that they are not an organization that eliminates risks. They're an organization that contains them, works with them, harnesses them. It's a very different mindset. And interestingly enough, by many measures would be seen as a pretty safe organization with very extraordinarily high safety capacities. So I think it really is important that we don't allow certain things to be weaponized. It is a great idea to get it right first time, but if we're getting it right first time because we've killed innovation and we've dumbed everything down, then we're not going to last very long. Okay, I think we're at time, David.
Yeah, great point. And just from us, I just want to say thank you to everyone. It's been a fantastic turnout and questions and comments in the chat. We've taken quite a narrow topic. At Safety Futures, we have we do have two or three I think really helpful programs to explore these ideas and what it means. One for operations managers and leaders, one for safety professionals specifically, and one for other roles in the organization that are responsible for enabling and supporting operational safety performance. So if you do want to check out safetyfutures.com, we do these as interactive online training programs like we've done here tonight. We get great participation from all over the world, including organizations in Asia as well. So thank you, everyone. Back to you, the organizers.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Dr. David and Mr. Mars. Interesting and very useful presentation. So please be reminded that the recording will be available in the coming weeks of time, so can be reviewed on the Hong Kong branch network page. And also there is a post-event survey that will be given in a couple of days. So please help to join the survey, and it helps the branch in planning future events. So thank you very much for joining us. It is the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for the participations, and we are look forward to seeing you all again in the coming Hong Kong branch event. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye all.